All right, so the second screencast on Chapter 10 deals with making decisions and forming judgments. One of the things that studies reveal is that we do tend to fly by the seat of our pants when we make decisions. We don't really go through a systematic process and algorithm when we're making decisions. Most of the time we use heuristics, those mental shortcuts we talked about. What we know is a downside to heuristics is the fact that it doesn't always guarantee a solution to a problem. Sometimes we make inaccurate conclusions using this method. So it is faster in terms of decision making, but it is sometimes inaccurate. Today we're going to talk about two different kinds of heuristics, one of them being representative and the other one being availability. The first type of heuristic is called representative. It's when we judge the likelihood of things in terms of how well they seem to represent or match particular prototypes. It may lead one to ignore other relevant information. One thing we've talked about in the past is how our prototypes, our mental images, our best examples of different categories or schemas can sometimes allow for us to stereotype or to make conclusions based on our past experiences, and they're not always correct. So, for example, if someone walked into my classroom and was really tall and had some characteristics that I believed were to be athletic, I might ask them if they play volleyball or are a high jumper. And if I find out that they're not an athlete, I might have made an error based on my already existing prototype of what an athlete should look like. Another example that I thought was kind of cute happened with my son Tommy when we were on the first floor in the high school. He was only about 4 years old. And we were in the restroom when Mrs. Johnson, the art teacher, walked in, and we were washing our hands, and I started talking to her, and I introduced my son Tommy to her. I said, "This is a coworker of mine. She teaches here at the high school too." And he turned and he looked at her and he asked her, "Are you part of my family?" Because according to Tommy, his prototype of a family member included a teacher that worked at the high school. So he made the mistake of assuming that it had to be a relative because of his already existing prototype. The next type of heuristic is called the availability heuristic. It's when we estimate the likelihood of events based on their availability in memory. If instances readily come to mind, perhaps because they're so vivid, we presume that events are common, when in fact they're not. In class today, we practiced a lockdown drill, and we talked about what potentially could happen if there was a school shooting or an intruder or some kind of attack. And we made very strategic plans that would be instituted in the likelihood that something tragic would happen. Well, statistically speaking, it's very unlikely. When you think of all the public schools in the United States and how many of them have actually fallen victim to a school shooting, the statistics are very one-sided, right? The chance is super slim. Yet, we think about the cases like in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, we think of Columbine or other school shootings, and they are very vivid, and they're tragic, and they're horrible. And so therefore, even though there's a very, 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 very small chance that it could happen here at Farmington, we plan accordingly. Another example of an availability heuristic might be if you have I use Ashley Becker as an example. When she, at the beginning of the school year during homecoming week, was so sick, and she looked at her symptoms and she looked at the events going on in the news with Ebola, and she made the conclusion that she, in fact, was going to be diagnosed with Ebola. Well, she made that mistake based on the vivid cases that she was seeing in the news. As you can see on this slide, casinos will sometimes entice us to gamble by signaling even small wins with bells and lights, making them very vivid and memorable, while keeping big losses soundlessly invisible. Another term in this section deals with overconfidence and how we have a tendency to be more confident than correct, to overestimate the accuracy of our beliefs and our judgments. Sometimes you see this in athletics with teams thinking that they're awesome and that they're better than another opponent, only to be crushed. Or sometimes you might relate to the fact that you're overconfident in your time management. Oh, I'll have time to study after I hang out with my friends, after I go to the game, after I do this or that, only to find out that, in fact, there's no way you can get all of your items on your to-do list crossed off. The good news is that people who are overconfident tend to live more happily. They find it easier to make tough decisions, and they actually seem more credible. Another term that is associated with this part of the chapter is called framing. It's very similar to what we learned about with wording effects in chapter 1. We know that the way an issue is posed can greatly affect our decisions and our judgments. So for example, if a doctor were to say, you have a 10% chance you're going to die in this surgical procedure, you're going to be very upset and you're going to not want to have the procedure done. Versus you have a 90% chance that you will be just fine undergoing this procedure. It really does change how you view that particular situation. Sometimes we make decisions and we form judgments based on what's called belief bias and belief perseverance. I like to use Santa Claus as an example in this case. When you read the definition for belief bias, it's the tendency for one's pre-existing beliefs to distort logical reasoning, sometimes by making invalid conclusions seem valid or valid conclusions seem invalid. For Santa, if you think about it, can Santa really fit down the chimney? Can reindeer really fly? Can he really deliver all those presents in one night? Well, of course, it's magic, right? That's belief bias. Let's just say you cling to your initial conceptions about Santa even after the basis on which they were formed has been discredited. Maybe you catch your parents filling your stockings in the middle of the night when you get up to get some water. Maybe you had snooped in your parents' room and had found some presents under their bed, and then you find them in your stocking on Christmas morning. And you convince yourself, well, Santa must have been running behind and needed mom and dad to put the presents in our stockings. Or maybe Santa planted them under your parents' bed knowing that his sleigh was going to be extra full that year. That's belief perseverance. One of the last things in this section talks about creativity, which is the ability to think in novel ways and come up with unique solutions to problems. A lot of you listening to this screencast right now can think in your head right now someone in your life who you believe exhibits this creative thinking. Ask yourself if they have some of these characteristics. Do they love to problem solve? Do they love to get in the middle of messy situations so that they can straighten things out and come up with simple solutions? Do they come up with a lot of options, selecting the preferred course of action? Are they risk takers? Do they understand failure is inevitable, but it is something that, will happen if you want success? Do they like getting constructive criticism? Do they find and seek out advice from other people? And do they do it because they are intrinsically motivated? Do they not solve problems for pay, compliments, or other external forms of reinforcement, but just because of the joy of possibly discovering the best possible outcome? That's what a characteristic or several characteristics include of creative people.